Want to know the secret to golf? I'll teach it to you in less than 20 minutes with a series of graphics. My name is Jon Sherman. I'm the author of the best-selling book, The 4 Foundations of Golf, co-host of the Sweet Spot podcast, and PGA Tour coach. Every golfer thinks birdies are the path to lower scores. They're not. It's actually less double bogeys. If you look at this chart from ShotScope, you can see that the lower handicaps are only averaging at most 2 birdies a round. But if you start looking down towards normal handicaps at the 10, 15, and 20 handicap level, you'll see that they make way more double bogeys, and birdies aren't even really part of the equation. Most golfers are going to average less than 1 birdie per round, but the real difference in performance is those bigger blow-up holes. So once you start hanging your hat on having less of those, your scores are going to absolutely plummet. Scoring in golf is primarily determined by tee shots and approach shots. Golfers of all levels separate themselves more with their driver and irons than with their wedges and putter. If you look at this chart from ShotScope, they did a really interesting study comparing PGA Tour players to handicaps from scratch all the way through 25. And you'll see that they're all losing strokes compared to tour players, of course. But what's interesting is where they lose the most strokes. And those are absolutely with their irons. Those are the biggest losses compared to tour players. So if you want to get your game in the right direction and lower your scores the most, it's primarily going to be driven, no pun intended, by your driver and irons. It's the truth about scoring that everyone needs to know, and I definitely recommend reading Mark Brody's book, Every Shot Counts. If you want to become a better ball striker, it's going to come down to 3 things, and you always hear this if you listen to my podcast, The Sweet Spot. Where are you striking it on the club face? How's your ground contact? And where is the club face pointing at impact, also known as club face control? So when you're practicing, you want to keep track of these 3 things. Where am I striking it on the club face? You can use a product like Dr. Scholl's Odor X spray to track where you're striking it on the driver or your iron's face. Next, you'll want ground contact feedback. This is so hard to do because most of us are practicing on artificial turf. That's why you always hear me talk about a product called the divot board. It's a great way to get feedback when you're on artificial turf. But if you do have access to a grass driving range, you could always leave something right next to the ball like a tee marker, or you can spray a line with your foot spray just to give you a visual representation of where your divots are taking place and where you're initiating contact with the ground. And lastly, with club face control, you really want to think about the start line of your golf ball. That is primarily determined about whether your face is too open or closed at impact. So I'm always thinking about these 3 things with every shot I'm hitting on the practice range or even when I'm playing golf. If I had to explain how to become a better putter in a very simple way, it's this. You have to learn how to make more putts inside of 10 feet. But once you get outside of that range, it's mostly about speed control and limiting 3 putts. If we look at this graph of 1 putt percentage makes at different skill levels, you'll see that PGA Tour players are only 50% from 8 feet. That's kind of the line in the sand. But once we see scratch golfers and even 90 shooters, those numbers start going down dramatically. So your best chance of becoming a better putter is increasing these odds inside of 10 feet. Of course, you're not going to make all of them, but more importantly, once you start getting outside of 20 feet, you'll start to see that 3-putt percentages start skyrocketing for higher handicaps. So I like to tell people, if you want to become a better putter and lower your scores quickly, you're going to have to focus on your speed control when you practice. This is a low-hanging fruit for a lot of players to reduce 3 putts from those 20, 30, and even 40-foot distances. Traditional stats are very poor predictors of performance on the course. Stats like fairways hit and putts per round just don't give you enough information. If you told me you only had 30 putts in a round, I have no idea what score you shot or even how well you putted. And if you told me you hit 60% of your fairways, I also have no idea how well you did off the tee. The only traditional stat that's worth keeping track of, and more importantly, building your game around, is greens in regulation. It is a direct correlation to scoring potential. If you look at these stats from ShotScope, as handicap drops and gets lower, people are hitting more greens. I always tell people, build your golf game around hitting more greens in regulation. It's the one stat that you can rely on to dictate your scoring potential. If we're talking about successful tee shots, as I said, fairways hit is not a great predictor of scoring. But what we do want to keep track of is how are you avoiding the big trouble? And more importantly, how big of a penalty this is. ShotScope came out with this image a few years ago using strokes gained analysis analysis, they're able to show what type of penalties you could expect off the tee. What I found most interesting about this was that the big trouble caused a disproportionate damage to scoring. So trees were costing golfers about 1.1 strokes. More importantly, hitting into fairway bunkers was almost a 1.5 stroke penalty for golfers of most levels. But what's even more interesting is that the light rough is not that big of a penalty. Yes, we obviously want to hit more fairways, but your ability to keep the ball in play and get it in the light rough is even more important for your scoring, so that you're avoiding the quote unquote big trouble. Here's another big myth. Scoring with your irons and wedges is not about knocking down pins and getting it inside of 10 feet. I used to play this way and I was so disappointed every time I hit a shot outside of that distance. And more importantly, I was making horrible strategic decisions. This is from millions of golf shots and real shots on courses from golfers of all level. You can see that the proximity from various yardages at different handicap levels is much larger than we think. If you look at a scratch golfer from 75 to 125 yards, we're only getting the ball about 40 feet from the hole. So you really need to retrain your mind to think that good shots with your irons or wedges are absolutely about getting it on the putting surface. If you can do that, you've achieved a huge goal and increased your chances of making a stress-free par, and more importantly, making a bogey at worst. And when you do miss the green, giving yourself more straightforward wedge shots. This could be easy lies in the fairways or the fringe, or when you're not short-sided and you have plenty of green to work with in the rough. These are also good shots because, again, one of the keys to golf is limiting double bogeys or worse. So when you hit these shots that are just off the green and they're manageable up and downs, you're gonna make more bogeys and pars and avoid those big numbers. So don't think that your irons and wedges need to be about pin hunting and knocking it close. It's just not a reasonable expectation for a golfer of any level. Here's another misconception about what a good shot represents. If you think you need laser accuracy off the tee with your driver or other clubs, you're absolutely wrong. If you take a look at this chart, this is a TrackMan report from one of the best amateur golfers in the world. The interesting thing was that with no pressure on him, you can see his dispersion is about 65 to 70 yards wide. And I've done this exercise with Mackenzie Hughes on the PGA Tour, who I've worked with for the last year and a half, and his was absolutely the same. So for golfers that hit it pretty far, they can expect to have a 60 to 70 yard dispersion between their left and right shots. You should know what a reasonable dispersion is for your shots and use that to plot out your targets on the course and where you can aim, so that, again, you can avoid the big trouble and keep the ball in play. So if I had one piece of advice that I've given golfers over the years that absolutely lowers scores overnight, it's taking more club. If you look at data from golfers at all levels, you see the same story over and over again. Here's another chart from ShotScope that shows how many greens are being missed on the short side from handicaps of all levels versus long. Almost no one is missing their greens on the long side. They're all coming up short. So the easiest thing to do for a player of any level is just take more club. Prove to yourself that you can get it to the green and sometimes even beyond the green, and you'll get that greens in regulation number moving in the right direction. Another myth that's persisted for so long is laying up to your favorite yardage. This could be on a short par 4, but most importantly, it comes up on a lot of par 5s. And it turns out it's just not true. Whether you're a PGA Tour player or a 90 shooter, closer is better. It doesn't matter if you're in the rough or the fairway. Your expected shots to hole out is always going to be better from 30 yards than it is from 80 yards. Now, of course, there are exceptions with players who maybe have the wedge heebie-jeebies. I understand that. But if I put most of you on a launch monitor and we did a test from 30 yards or 80 yards, you'll see that your dispersion towards your target is much tighter when you get closer to the hole. Advance the ball as far as possible without taking on excessive risk. And what I mean by that is that if there's a cluster of fairway bunkers, water, trees that are closer to the hole, then yes, it does make sense to lay further back. But all things being equal, if it's just fairway and rough, you're gonna wanna get the ball as close to the hole as possible. And again, this is a long-term strategy that lowers scores over the long term. So for the last decade, all we've been talking about is distance off the tee. Obviously, the average driver distance on the PGA Tour has exploded and everyone's hitting it over 300 yards. But I don't want you to think that you need prodigious distance to reach your goals as a golfer. If you look at this chart from Arcos, you can see that the average driving distance for scratch golfers isn't that long. Hitting it 220 or 230 yards off the tee is quite normal for the average male golfer. But there are so many different ways to add 10 to 20 yards that can make a huge difference for your game, which could be through learning to hit your driver more towards the center of the face, increasing your angle of attack, getting fit into the right driver, the center of gravity and the loft settings are super important. So again, I don't want you to believe that in order to get to your best level of golf, you need to hit it 290 yards. yards. While that would be nice, it's not in the cards for everyone. You can play really good golf if you're hitting it 230, 240, or even 250 off the tee. So a lot of golfers have been taught to believe that the harder they hit putts, the more that they're gonna go in the hole. And this really comes into play on shorter putts. So if you get to those 4, 5, 6 footers, you'll hear a lot of golfers saying, oh, I wanna hit it harder to take the break out. And there's really only one golfer I've ever seen in the history of the game who's been really good at that, and his name is Tiger Woods. Tiger's face control from 5 feet was so exceptional that yes, he could hit the ball harder to take the break out of it, but he also was gonna hit his line every time, and he really wasn't worried about that 3 or 4 footer coming back. A more important concept for everyone to understand is the hole capture size. If you take a look at this image, it shows that the farther you hit the ball past the hole, you're effectively making the hole smaller. So if you're hitting too many putts that are gonna end up 2, 3, or even 4 feet past the hole, you're just making the hole smaller and harder for the ball to get in there. You really want the ball to finish 12 to 18 inches past the cup as a more optimal speed so that you can actually increase the size of the cup. And I've done this over the years and I've made so many more short putts because of this. So don't think that you need to jam it in there. So here's a pretty easy rule of thumb for your tee shot strategy. If you have big trouble on one side of the hole, so if it's trees, fairway bunkers, out of bounds, a water hazard, and the other side of the hole is just rough, the easiest thing to do is aim away from the trouble to lower your expected score on the hole. This was another great takeaway from Mark Brody's book. The more skilled you are as a golfer, the less you have to aim away from it. So for example, a scratch golfer, if there was big trouble on the right side of the fairway, they would maybe aim up the left center of the fairway and adjust a little bit. But let's say you were 10, 15, or 20 handicap, then actually it would make sense to maybe aim towards the rough on the left side, especially if there was out of bounds. So a good rule of thumb is the bigger the trouble is, the more you have to aim away from it. So if I ask most golfers what good greenside wedge play is, whether they're in the rough, the fairway, or a bunker, they're gonna say, oh, I've gotta hit it inside of 5 or 10 feet in one putt. This type of thinking can be dangerous because it can get you a little too aggressive. But if we look at the proximity numbers of players of all levels, you can see that even scratch golfers are not getting it inside a 10-foot circle of the hole most of the time. So what does good wedge play usually look like? I would say that a good wedge shot for most players is getting it somewhere between 10 to 20 feet from the hole, because from this distance, you're most likely going to 2-putt, which means you're going to avoid double bogeys or worse. Redefining what a good wedge shot is for your skill level can be so transformational because you'll pick better targets and take on shots that don't feel like you need to do anything incredible. The big takeaway there is that you don't need to be a hero and pull off exceptional flop shots like Phil or Seve. So many golfers, when they're on the tee, think that a shorter club will be more accurate. This isn't always true. I've looked at some data across all the shot tracking platforms, and I found that 3-woods are actually not as accurate as most people think. So if you're on the tee box thinking I need to hit a 3-wood here to keep it in play, take a look at this graph. You'll see that fairways hit with a driver or 3-wood from almost every handicap level is really not that different. But what you are sacrificing is 20 to 30 yards, and when you're further away from the hole on a par 4 or par 5, you're just making the hole harder for yourself and increasing your expected score. And one of the main reasons for this is club head design. Modern drivers are huge. They have a ton of forgiveness built into them called MOI, whereas 3-woods are really designed to be hit off the ground. You're hitting a long club with a smaller face, and oftentimes golfers have a hard time striking the center of the face. They're gonna lose a ton of distance and accuracy. So don't always assume that safety clubs are actually safer. If you're a golfer who plays in the wind a lot, this is a concept that can save you so many strokes. Headwinds hurt more than tailwinds help. This is an image from Ping's ball fitting system called Ballnamic. And you can see on this chart that when you're hitting a driver into a 20-mile-per-hour wind, you're actually gonna lose more distance in that instance than it would help you if you're hitting 20 miles per hour downwind. And the reason for this is that when you hit into a headwind, the ball is going to climb more and lose more distance. But when you hit downwind or with the tailwind, it actually knocks the ball down a little bit. And most golfers don't take enough club when they're hitting into the wind, or take too little club with the wind. So always remember, again, that headwinds hurt more than tailwinds help. This should help you make better strategic decisions when it's gusty out there. So when golfers are trying to explain proper strategy to each other or how to play a golf course, they often say, oh, you're gonna wanna keep this one below the hole because it's a very sloped green. This is one of the most flawed strategy concepts out there. If you actually look looked at the differences between downhill versus uphill putts, you're not going to see a significant difference in make rates. Most golfers would say, yes, I'm going to hit more uphill putts and make them. While this is slightly true, the real issue is that when you pursue uphill putts, you're actually just going to leave yourself further from the hole. So let's say you had a chip shot and you wanted to leave the ball below the hole. Obviously, you're picking a target that's maybe 5, 10, or 15 feet short of the hole. Some of those shots are going to finish short of your target and some are going to go long. So you're going to end up leaving yourself more 20 footers and 30 footers uphill versus getting it closer to the hole. So the overall piece of advice you should know is that don't get cute with it. Getting it closer to the hole is always the better decision, and I don't care what the green looks like. So don't try and leave yourself a specific type of putt with your irons or wedges. You're just doing more harm than good. If you like this video, these are all images and concepts from my best-selling book, The 4 Foundations of Golf. Check it out on Amazon. And don't miss my other video where I give you 9 powerful and actionable mental techniques that help make me a PGA Tour coach.